Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. For our guests here in-house, we would ask that courtesy to see that mobile devices have been silenced or turned off. And, of course, those watching online now or in the future are welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. Leading our discussion this morning is Dr. James Carafano. He serves as Vice President for our Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy Studies. He is also the E.W. Richardson Fellow. He is a graduate of West Point, a 25-year veteran of the Army, a prolific writer and researcher, as well as accomplished historian and teacher. He has also serves as an adjunct professor at Georgetown University and serves as a visiting professor at the National Defense University. He previously served as an assistant professor at the U.S. Military Academy and director of military studies at the Army's Center for Military History. He also has served on the Board of Trustees of the Marine Corps University Foundation and the advisory boards of the West Point Center for Oral History and Hamilton Society and Operation Renewed Hope. Please join me in welcoming James Carafano.
Thank you. Thanks. Well, thanks for coming. One of the great things about being me is I get to do whatever I want. So I thought it was, it's true. I wanted to bring smart people together to talk about something I'm really puzzling on. So we've, I think, had a great success against transnational terrorism with the physical defeat of the Caliphate in the Middle East. But then the question is kind of what comes next. I mean, we could just go through all the different flashpoints that we have from Lebanon to Syria to Yemen to Somalia and on and on and on. And I think one of the lessons learned that I've seen in the 20 years that Steve and I have been doing this stuff is that one of the big variables is what we do, is when the West, particularly the United States, in a sense, is not serious and consistent in focusing on the transnational terrorism threat, it comes back. And when we are very serious about it, it recedes. And so I do think we're at an inflection point, and I am curious about where do we go and where should we go from here. So I'm really pleased to have this panel, and I'm not going to suck up any more time. I'm going to introduce our panel briefly, and then I'll ask each of them to speak, and then I'd love to have a conversation. So hopefully we can have questions and comments and that. And we have a saying in Heritage, which is we start late, but we always end on time. So I'll start with Dr. Khattab, who is a specialist in U.S. Arab relations, and her research spans media biases, sectarianism, extremism, and governance. That sounds like an office I used to work in, because she worked as a meeting consultant and director, a PR account manager, and also in the banking industry. She's authored an important book on the Arab lobby and the reasons for success and failures. It was published by Routledge UK. The Arabic version was published by the Center for Arab Unity for Studies in Beirut. She regularly publishes on U.S. relations in the Arab and Gulf region in a number of regional newspapers. She is a weekly columnist on the Bahraini newspaper Al Watan. She's a regular in Middle East TV stations. She participates in numerous workshops and conferences and is a member of the Arab Council of Social Studies, and her doctorate is from the University of Exeter. But she has an MBA and MA from American University in Beirut, and she is also organizing a think tank in the region. And when we start, maybe you could just spend a minute or two talking about your think tank, if you do that. And Sigurd Neubauer, close enough. Mr. Neubauer is a Middle East analyst based here in Washington. His expertise includes Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and which are all countries which are absolutely intimate and critical to this conversation, so I'm really glad you're here. Persian Gulf security and the Inter-Gulf Cooperation Council dynamics, which is a polite way for which political scientists say chaos. He's an expert in Arab-Israeli relations and also in Afghanistan, which is also kind of a critical issue, and one that the U.S. National Security Council is going to be, the U.S. government is going to be doing their review of Afghan policy this summer. So that's, and there'll be decisions coming out, so that's an important issue to discuss. He frequently appears and is quoted in international media, including papers in the region, Al Arabiya, Al Jazeera, CNN, Fox News, Foreign Affairs, and the New York Times. His work has been translated into Arabic and Farsi. He was a non-resident fellow at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, D.C., and a columnist for Al Arabiya, and he's fluent in several languages, and his graduate degree is from Yeshiva University in New York. Where he studied Jewish history, political science, and French literature, which all seem like they go together well. And last is Jim Phillips, who is our long-standing analyst here at the Heritage Foundation. It has been claimed that Jim has been working on the Middle East longer than there was a Middle East. I don't think that's actually true. I actually think they were birthed simultaneously. But Jim actually has the distinction of being the not the oldest, that's not fair, the longest serving analyst at the Heritage Foundation. And he is a world-class expert on this region. And when we were working through the presidential transition issues, a lot of Jim's work was just fundamental to the things we were putting together as we were helping get the administration up and running. So, Doctor, I think we'll start with you, and then we'll just work our way down, and then we'll just open the floor to a discussion. So.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you all for being here. Jim asked me not to do any publicity, but to speak half a minute about our think tank. We a year ago, established a think tank. I'm the executive director. It's an independent think tank, and it's based in Abu Dhabi. And the niche of our think tank, why it's special, because it likes to focus, it likes to link to the economic, to the political. For example, if you don't give jobs, you cannot really get rid of Daesh, like all these people who were employed by Daesh. So that's our main differentiator, which is linking the political to the economy. And now, to start my talk, I want to talk about 2 points. I want to go back because the title of this session is What's the Future of ISIS or After ISIS? I want to talk about 2 things. What are the causes of extremism we see today? And what do we expect? And what should we do? What are the steps that should be taken? Well, the extremism we see today is very, very different of the extremism of the 90s. Because the 90s, the extremism that resulted in terrorism was pan-Islamic and anti-imperialist, and it was a reaction for the military base in the Arab Gulf, in the Arabian Peninsula. And now, the extremism we see is purely a byproduct of sectarianism, and it's more virulent. I'll tell you why. Because the extremism of the 90s was a response to a collective threat. Because the average like Saudi felt that Islam is being under attack. But today it's different because the attack is there and it's real. Like, you know, the Sunni families in Deir ez-Zor, they feel they've been attacked. They are being physically attacked by the Shia militia. So it's a direct. We have one is a response to a collective threat, but today it's a response to a direct threat, which makes it more effective in mobilizing people. I'll go back to the reasons, to the causes of extremism. And it started with the invasion of Iraq, the second Iraq war, second Gulf War. And actually, the Americans did 2 huge mistakes. Number one was the de-Baathification. At the stroke of a pen, 400,000 people became insurgents because they were denied jobs, but at the same time, these were trained people and they kept their arms. The second thing the American did was the Constitution, because the Constitution divided people into Sunni, Shia, and Kurds. So when the law looks at you as a Sunni or a Shia and a Kurd, not as an Iraqi, you'll feel that you're a Sunni or a Shia and a Kurd before you feel that you're an Iraqi. And also, what complicated the invasion is Ayatollah Sistani issued a fatwa not to resist the American, which made the Sunni look at the Shias as collaborators. And also, the American, they had this idea that the Shia have been oppressed for so long, so they deserve a chance. Also, they look at them as less, like even the militias, though despite their relation to Iran, they were seen as less of a threat than the Saddamists and al-Qaeda. And the reprisals were at low intensity, but then when there was the Askaria bombing, Askaria is one of the very holy Shia shrine in Iraq. And then after that, really, the sectarianism, like the violence became at an unprecedented level. the Shia militia, Jaish al-Mahdi or Faylaqat Badr were taking the data of people from the Ministry of Interior and going after them. However, there was a correction, there was the surge, which was very, very successful. There was the awakening and there was national reconciliation. And the violence diminished at a very low level. However, all the outcomes of the surge were reversed due to the early disengagement of America. This was a very bad decision by President Obama to disengage while the surge was still fragile, while the outcome of the surge were still fragile. So Malki undid everything, undid the surge. All the people of the Sahawat, he went after them, he killed them. I wish a colleague of mine was supposed to come. She's Iraqi, she would have spoke more about this. And he usurped the judicial system to his own will. And this is how the Qaeda that was alienated during the surge found itself another opportunity to reemerge. And this is where we have the marriage of convenience between al-Qaeda, represented by Zarqawi, and between the Saddamists, the two high-ranking officers of Saddam, Mohammed al-Duri and Ahmad Yunus. And this was the nucleus of ISIS. And actually, the Syrian crisis gave it impetus because, you know, with Assad, because in Syria, the Sunni look at the government as Assad, not as the Alawite rule, and especially with the engagement of Hezbollah. When Hezbollah was engaged in the Syrian conflict, they used a very sectarian narrative. They didn't go to Syria telling their people we're going to defend a strategic partner. No, they had the slogan that we are going to defend the tomb of Zainab, which is also a Shia shrine, from the Umayyad. Umayyad, it's a long story, but these are the ones who, let's say, started Sunnism, you know. And the embittered Sunni created a fertile ground for ISIS to start its endeavor. The first place ISIS took was Raqqa in March 2013. And this is how we had the sectarianism. So now, what do we expect? Now, ISIS is being defeated militarily, it's being bombed, but does it mean it's defeated? I don't think so, because the social incubator is still there. The insecurity is still there. It takes one person, only one person, to radicalize a whole village. So what do we expect in the future? First of all, we don't expect any stability, because as long as Assad is there will always be, the refugees will not come back, there will always be opposition. As we see now, once one front closes, another front opens. You have now a lot of disparity between the Sunni and the Shia. Don't forget, all the areas that are being bombed are Sunni area, whether in Mosul, whether they're being bombed by the coalition or by Assad forces. I'll give you an example. For example, Aleppo in Syria, which is a Sunni city, and it's the industrial center of Syria. Now all the factories relocated to Tartus and Latakia, which are Alawites. So this will means that the Sunni area are even poorer and poorer, and this will create more dissentiment among the Sunnis. Also, if you look in Iraq, the Sunni Iraqi doesn't look at the armed forces as national. And this is a big problem. So you don't see cooperation. It doesn't have legitimacy in the eyes of the Sunnis. If you take, for example, Lebanon, the army of Lebanon was very, very successful in fighting extremism. And they fought terrorists. It goes back to 2000, when in Syria al-Daniya you had the extremism from al-Qaeda who wanted to do an emirate in Syria al-Daniya. The reason why the army has been so successful in fighting terrorists is because everywhere the army goes, the people cooperate with the army, because they look at the army as being impartial, not sectarian and national. So it's not Sunni, it's not Shia, it's not Christian, it's not Muslim. You don't have this with the Iraqi forces, armed forces. So, and also regarding ISIS, if it's defeated now, that doesn't mean if defeated on the battleground, it doesn't mean it's defeated. Defeated on the losing ground, it means they have to dedicate less effort to collect the trash from the schools, police the people. Then they can dedicate more effort to attacks. And we notice every time ISIS loses locally, they defect that by doing attacks in the West to keep their prestige. You know, the most hideous attack, which is the Paris attack in 2015, happened after they lost Mount Sinjar. So unfortunately, I don't have good news to tell you. We don't expect any more. We expect more radicalization from the Sunni part, and we don't expect any stability in the near future. So what should be done? In a nutshell, if we want to fight terrorism, we should not take terrorism in its narrow sense, in a narrow sense. Because now terrorism is not like in the 90s where you have few lunatics who are in the caves of Tora Bora. No, it's different. Now extremism is entrenched in the society. You have to dry up the social incubator, and it's not by bombing them. And if we want to take an example, when fighting terrorism was successful, I'll go back to the surge. The surge was successful because it was done simultaneously. They treated the al-Qaeda the same way they treated the Shia militias, and they went after them simultaneously, and that's why it was successful. Now, with the Obama administration, they've been thinking, which I think is very bad, which is sequencing. It says, like, let them destroy themselves. Which one is a more direct threat? The al-Qaeda, you know, the ISIS. So we let Assad, the Shia militia, loose. Let them destroy them, and then we think what we do with Assad and the Shia militias. But this is bad because they don't destroy each other. They feed each other. And actually, the existence of a threat will help radicalize the Sunni. It will not inhibit the radicalization. So, in a more concrete steps, other than changing this whole overall approach and looking at terrorism as a solution to terrorism in a comprehensive manner, if we say as steps, what should we do? First of all, we need a new awakening in Iraq. You need another national reconciliation. The army needs to be restructured to become really national. And it needs to have legitimacy in the eye of everyone. And then you need to work on the disparity in the Sunni area, because the disparity creates resentments. And also, as long as Assad is there will be no solution. So they should really think about that, about what to do with Assad. And also, finally, you need to engage with the local councils. Now in Syria, there are like 300 local councils, the latest count. These represent a civil alternative. Engaging with them will be a best choice to fight terrorism. So you have to go at the grassroots level. And this is the foundation to build governance, legitimate governance, sustainable governance in the country. So in a nutshell, in the short run, what form of governance we should work on? It should be an inclusive governance. An inclusive governance where everyone feel they are part of the political process. They don't feel there is a threat. But in the long run, the best way to fight terrorism is through a civil state. Because when you have a civil state, all these differences, the sectarianism, tribalism, ethnicity, they fade away when the citizen is treated as equal. And we can see as an example Tunisia. Tunisia fought extremism not by the army. They fought it because they have a civil state. Even the Islamist group, which is al-Nahda, which is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, they had to rebrand, they had to change. They said, we are now a civil party with an Islamic background. So I think in the long run, our only hope is to work on a civil state.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we had a view from the inside looking out. Now we can get a view from the outside looking in.
It is such a pleasure to be here this morning, and thank you for the opportunity. Dave is a good friend of mine, Dave DeRoche, so I'm happy to substitute for him while he sits on the plane, hopefully on business class, having a good time. Anyways, what I'll try to look at is what the present U.S. policy is towards the Middle East. As we know, President Trump will announce at 2 o'clock this afternoon whether or not the United States will remain within the so-called JCPOA, the Iran agreement, and that decisions will have ripple impacts on Iraq, Syria, the Gulf, and what U.S. policy towards the region could look like going forward. Going back to February, there are a few things, there are a few important diplomatic developments in the region that have been missed by many regional observers, including here in Washington, because it seems that we have one news day after another, and we don't quite know what to expect next. So let me just allow to give you a little background of what has happened that could help inform President Trump's strategy going forward, whether or not he stays or decides to stay within the JCPOA. And some of you may recall that then Secretary of State Rex Tillerson in early February or mid-February paid a regional visit that accumulated with the so-called Kuwait Summit. And the Kuwait Summit's purpose was really to raise money for post-ISIS reconstruction in Iraq. We know that Kuwait, because of its traumatic experience with the Iraqi occupation in the 1990s, feels an obligation towards shepherding stability in Iraq and has played a tremendous diplomatic role, but also put money towards these efforts. And just to give you the data here, Kuwait pledged $1 billion in direct investments at the conference. Saudi Arabia and Qatar each pledged $1 billion, and the UAE pledged $500 million in assistance and $5.5 billion in loans for the Baghdad government. Now, these are pledges, and whether or not these pledges will be actualized will be contingent on two factors. The first factor is President Trump's announcement this afternoon, and the second factor will be the outcome of the Iraqi elections, which is also taking place on the 12th. Assuming that Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi wins, we could see some momentum moving forward on what has been a positive trajectory of normalization between Saudi Arabia and the UAE and the Iraqi government in particular over the last couple of years. Assuming that that Noor al-Maliki and his bloc wins the Iraqi election, I would say all bets are off, because we know that he has had quite an anti-American agenda, and there is no reason to assume that it will be different this time. And then if President Trump withdraws from the JCPOA, we can expect that Iran will double down in its efforts in Iraq, because it's really important to understand that what some analysts have missed about Trump's desire to be unpredictable about the JCPOA is that he's using that uncertainty as leverage. Why? Because we know that the Iranian government is dependent on sanctions relief coming from the JCPOA. And if you look at the recent riots in Iran, which were economically driven, without the sanctions relief and without opening up Iran to foreign investment, the Iranian government will not have enough money to sustain the economy, to pay for the government expenses, and with that will not have enough money to spread mischief, to put it diplomatically, in the region. So the idea was to create uncertainty over Iran's over the JCPOA to so to speak, squeeze the Iranian government. That's been the understanding of why Trump is playing this strategy. A lot of the criticism against the JCPOA at the time, when it was negotiated, was really not about the technicality of the agreement, whether about sunset clause that you could say sunset clause that could be extended, or verification systems could be improved. These are really not, in my view as an analyst, the core of the apple. The core of the apple was that at the time there was a feeling that the Iranian government was about to collapse from its economic malaise. And the criticism was really that the Obama administration extended a lifeline to engage with the Iranians, and instead of letting it collapse. You know, that could be argued either way. We don't quite know, but we are where we are today. And so this is bound to have a lot of uncertainty on how Iraq will go forward. Now, let's take the other side of the argument, and let's assume that President Trump stays within the Iran agreement. And let's assume for a moment that Haider al-Abadi wins re-election on the 12th. Then what kind of momentum or movement could we find on the U.S. diplomatic front engaging in the region? And it is within this context, Washington has been, at least up until now, executing what appears to be a two-pronged strategy that focuses on the reconstruction of territory liberated from ISIS, while at the same time seeking to ensure that Iraq does not evolve into an Iranian vassal state built on Lebanon's Hezbollah model. And this is really important to understand, because some of the diplomatic momentum that Rex Tillerson was able to build on going into the Kuwait summit was that movement between the Iraqi government and Saudi Arabia, and with U.S. pressure, was able to prevent the Kurdish regional government and the Shiite government of Iraq from confrontation right after the Kurdish referendum in September, as you surely recall. So these diplomatic developments were able to sustain the gains that had been achieved after ISIS was defeated from Mosul and from these areas. And sustaining these gains going forward will be critical. So the question is, how can that be done? The idea was, of course, was to use the Gulf, the wealthy six-nation members of the Arabian Gulf, or the Gulf Cooperation Council, to, on one hand, bring in the necessary resources for post-Iraq reconstruction, as was embodied at the Kuwait summit. On the other hand, we have seen some media reports recently that President Trump, who has not only called for an end to this nasty dispute, which has also played out here in Washington in horrible ways, he has called on these six nations to play a larger military role even in Syria. So what would that entail? It would probably entail some sort of peace and stability operations to bring the Arab states to play a stabilizing role in the region. In order to do that, of course, the issue in the Gulf has to be settled, because we know that that's a political dispute. So I think that that's where there's some momentum going forward. I think also what we will look at is what kind of U.S. diplomatic pressure will there be on the Iraqis to make sure that the election is not only technically competent, but also to minimize any sort of Iranian meddling in the election and influence the parties going forward. These are difficult questions, of course. And then, broader speaking, I think that if there is a deal to be had with the Iranians, it's on its regional interference. And how do you use uncertainty and over the JCPOA to pressure the Iranians to modify their behavior in the region? And that is, of course, the diplomatic questions that everybody is trying to understand. But what we have seen so far is that Trump's unpredictable and hardball tactics have actually brought the North Koreans to the negotiations table, and few people would have predicted that a year ago. So who is to say that we cannot negotiate with the Iranians under different terms? But I'll leave it at that.
Thanks. Jim?
Okay. I'm here to say that Islamist extremism has a very bright future after ISIS is dead and buried. And I would caution that ISIS is not.
I'm glad I didn't eat
or
lunch
buried.
first.
Yeah, that will surprise nobody here. But many of the conditions that paved the way for the rise of the ISIS are still replete in the region. That's dysfunctional government, sectarian tension, civil wars, foreign interventions. And although ISIS has been militarily whittled away, it's a very resilient and determined organization. It made a comeback once before, back in 2009, after the U.S. turned its back in Iraq. And if that happens again, then ISIS will be back much quicker than I think people expect. But back then, when it was known as the Islamic State of Iraq, before that, al-Qaeda in Iraq, it was decimated and militarily defeated, but the political conditions that gave rise to it continued, and they're still there, particularly in Syria, but also to a lesser extent in Iraq, unless these elections go well. So not only is ISIS going to try to make a comeback, but it could mutate and be followed on by other type Islamist extremist organizations. And here I think it's possible to make much faster and more sustained progress in Iraq than in Syria because of the reasons mentioned. Assad, as long as Assad is in power, he's a perfect foil for ISIS, a non-Sunni, sectarian, brutal government that's going to continue to feed Sunni extremism. And not only although there's been a lot of attention on ISIS, it's important to remember that al-Qaeda is still there. It's growing like a fungus in northwest Syria, in Idlib province. It's folded itself into a series of fronts. It's changed its name. Now it's the Organization for the Liberation of the Sham or Greater Syria. And it's seeking to absorb the resources of other groups and eventually hijack them and absorb them into a greater al-Qaeda. So even if ISIS is gone, al-Qaeda is going to remain. I think it's hopeful in Iraq with the May 12th elections in order to build a more inclusive government, as Khattab said. But it's going to be very difficult to translate some of the good things that are being said by Prime Minister Abadi into real change on the ground inside Iraq to build up an inclusive structure in which the Sunni Arab minority, which is ISIS's target audience, they feel that they have a stake in the future of an Iraqi government. Because although many Sunni Arabs rejected the harsh ideology of ISIS, they saw it as a lesser evil compared to what they perceived to be illegitimate governments in Baghdad and Damascus. And that may change in Iraq. It's not going to change in Syria. So ISIS, as well as al-Qaeda, is going to remain a factor. And then also I think one generally under-reported threat vector for ISIS is going to be the refugee camps. And historically, extremist groups have flourished in refugee camps, going back to the Palestinian camps, which generated many extremist groups, particularly in countries that were hostile to Israel. The Taliban, which came out of the Pakistani Afghan refugee camps with substantial help from Pakistani ISI intelligence. They grew from the camps to take over a big chunk of Afghanistan. So I think Washington, Baghdad, and the Erbil, the Kurdistan regional government, need to be cognizant of this long-term threat and take steps to prevent ISIS from anchoring itself and embedding itself in these refugee camps. And in Syria, this is going to be even more of a problem because there's a lot more external refugees and a lot more internally displaced people. So that's going to be a long-term gift for ISIS that's going to keep giving. Looking outside of Iraq and Syria, it's important to note that ISIS is still expanding, particularly in Asia, Afghanistan, the Philippines, It's flourishing in growing slower, but still growing in places that are racked by civil wars, such as Yemen, Somalia. It sustained some setbacks in Libya, but it remains a threat. And it's still in Africa, where it's still allied with the Nigerian movement. Secondly, another factor that's going to favor extremism outside of even ISIS or al-Qaeda is the fact that there were more than 25,000 foreign fighters that flocked to the so-called Caliphate, and many of them were killed there, but some of them are returning home and could become a reservoir of support for ISIS or future such Islamist extremist movements. Third, the civil wars in Libya, Yemen, and Somalia are very attractive places where ideological movements, extremist movements continue to flourish. It's important to note that state support for extremism is still very strong, and it's not just a Sunni phenomenon. As previous speakers mentioned, Iran is pumping out a lot of support for Shiite extremists. In the Iraqi militias, Iran has developed a foreign legion, recruiting as far away, Shiites from as far away as Afghanistan and Pakistan, and is deploying this foreign legion in Syria. It's part of what I see as this kind of Hezbollah strategy of radicalizing and breaking off splinters of pre-existing groups and turning them into more of a surrogate type operation. And we're seeing it even in Yemen with the Houthis. And those kind of Shiite extremist movements are not going to go away anytime soon, and they're going to help fuel the Sunni extremists in reaction. That said, there's also room for optimism, which, they say in the Middle East, a realist is an optimist with experience. But there are some reasons to look ahead with optimism, and one was mentioned, that today's announcement on Iran is likely to lead to enhanced U.S. sanctions on Iran, which will reduce the amount of resources Iran can distribute to its Shiite foreign legion, as well as to the Sunni extremists it supports, because Iran can be very ecumenical when it comes to furthering its national interests. Talking about its support for Hamas, Palestine, Islamic Jihad, and even non-Islamist extremists, such as the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, General Command, which also has done Iran's bidding in the past. So that's one reason for optimism. I think a second reason is the push for reform in Saudi Arabia, where Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has been talking about the need for a more tolerant Islam. I think it's going to be a very difficult long haul to change the Faustian bargain that the royal family has made with some of the Wahhabi religious leaders, but I think he's saying some good things, and if he succeeds, that could have a pronounced long-term effect in changing kind of the ecology of financial support for these kind of Sunni extremist groups. And finally, when it comes to U.S. policy, I agree with many of the suggestions of the previous speakers, and I overlap in many respects. I would just add that we shouldn't see this just as a Sunni phenomenon, that although Hezbollah has been out of the news, at least in this country, it's really fueling a lot of future terrorism in Syria. It's training Iraq, not only Iraqi militias, but the Houthis and elsewhere, and expanding the base of extremism. And that just goes to the point that Iran is part of the problem. It shouldn't be seen as part of the solution, I think the last administration did see ISIS as perhaps a unifying influence that could bring Iran and the U.S. together. But Iran, the regime sees ISIS more, as it's publicly said, as a U.S. creation and does not see that same basis for cooperation. So with that, let me just turn it open to questions. I
want to get the microphone, bring Robin Simcox in the conversation, because the one thing I found interesting is what all of you seem to suggest in your own way is this notion that the center of gravity of this problem is really in the Middle East, and that the challenge is really in the state policies. Is what are you doing with Iraq? What happens in Syria? What happens in Lebanon? What happens in Yemen? I found that interesting. So, but Robin's our expert on what's radicalization, what's going on in Western Europe, and I want to ask him how that fits in and squares with what he just heard.
Well, yeah, certainly the situation in the Middle East drove so many of the Europeans, or at least it was a factor in driving Europeans to Syria in 2013. I guess one of my kind of observations just from hearing the panel, I would be intrigued if you could kind of flesh out a little bit more about how you see the situation in Syria now, where you've got a status quo where ISIS has been pushed out of many of the conservative Sunni Arab areas, but the force that is replacing it and is holding that territory, for example, kind of Marxist cult in some areas, is not one that seems to me to be a long-term viable force that can hold some of these Sunni Arab areas. So I'd be wondering if you could comment on that.
Yeah, so let's try to collect a few questions, and then I'll have each of the panelists kind of pick and choose what they go. So are there questions for the audience? So so this is one of them, kind of more specificity in what the actual policies might be in Syria. Others? Steve, do you want to?
I guess trying to get below or down to the level that I usually work at. You know, I know you talked about the economic end of it and trying to, the development part. What else can we do? You know, other than killing bad guys, which unfortunately I think is the easiest part of this kind of operation. How else can we address this other than trying to, you know, develop things, get jobs? You know, we know that sort of takes people's minds off of killing each other. Unfortunately, usually not fast enough. But what other tactics, if you will, can we add to the toolbox, or should we, you know, hope our governments add to the toolbox to try and address this? And that's for all of you.
Okay. Other question? Yes, sir.
It has been mentioned that Assad is part of the problem and really a source for extremism. What do you think should be done with Assad? I mean, this is a huge question, I know, but if there are any suggestions on what should be done with Assad.
Yeah. Emily,
yeah, I want to follow up on Steve's question. So you, Ms. Khatib, you talked about civil society and building that, and I'd like to hear more about what you think the U.S. government and the actors in the region can do to build up civil society. Who are our partners to build up human rights, which is essential for building a stronger civil society?
So let's do this. We have about 10 minutes. So let me cycle back through the panel, and if we could just maybe split that up with each one taking a couple of minutes, and kind of pulling all the questions together. If we could just, you know, go through the laundry list of Yemen, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Libya, kind of the countries of concern, some specificity about what do you think some of the things we could be done, either in the civil society side or in the political dimension, or what do you do about Assad, and just kind of give your laundry list of recommendations you have. And maybe we'll start with Jim and work this way, and if you could each take maybe 2 minutes or so, we'd be good.
Well, just getting back to your point about the perceived illegitimacy of some of the Kurdish forces in Arab parts of Syria, I think that is going to be a long-term, a short-term problem, and then the Syrian Democratic Forces need to be broadened out to include as many local Arabs as possible, and that this is something that the U.S. alone is not very well equipped to do, but perhaps with the greater cooperation, particularly with some of the Gulf cooperation allies. I know the Trump administration is asking for the Saudis and Emiratis to step forward and help stabilize eastern Syria and help replace U.S. forces that are gradually going to be withdrawn. Perhaps the British and French can contribute more there, but I think the U.S. is out of the nation-building business, and so it needs to work more closely with allies that have financial resources that they can help stabilize these kind of liberated areas from ISIS in order to build some kind of governance there. But I think Arab allies are much better equipped to identify the problems and help the local Arabs there to build more inclusive structures. Elsewhere and in some of these other areas, I think the U.S. should work closely with recognized governments wherever possible. In Yemen, that is a pretty weak internationally recognized government, but ultimately there's got to be some kind of a political settlement there, because the two warring coalitions do not have the military wherewithal to gain an outright victory. So there's got to be some settlement, and the sooner the better, I think, in order to weaken Iranian influence over the Houthis. But that's going to be a very difficult diplomatic row to hoe also. And I think it would help if the Trump administration will put a higher priority in repairing the break between the Saudis and the Emiratis and Qatar, because that only helps Iran. And that should be very high on the diplomatic list.
Yeah, and just you kind of restate what you said about, this administration is not in the nation-building business. That just means that this administration is not interested in a large physical presence on the ground. It doesn't mean, or it shouldn't mean, that it's not going to be engaged diplomatically, politically, and providing resources and leadership and working with partners in the region. Right?
Yeah, I hope it doesn't, but I'm nervous about the massive economic resources that are going to be needed for humanitarian aid and reconstruction, some of these areas, and the important thing of generating jobs. I don't think the U.S. should be involved in generating jobs. I think that's up to local governments and our also with the aid from GCC allies.
Thanks.
I'll add a couple of points. The first point was that at the Kuwait summit, the largest contributor was Turkey, and it is expected that in the post-ISIS reconstruction, there are a lot of Turkish businesses that are geographically close and have the cultural fluency and understanding and relationships in the region can play an important role. So I think that that's already happening. The second part that is really important, I think, is to understand that in this environment, holding the status quo is a goal in itself. Mm-hmm. What we have seen with the collapse of the Gulf Cooperation Council over this crisis is that unless the United States actually engages at every stage, bad things can happen. And going to the Syria and Iraq part, I think that if you look at the political dynamics in the region, in the Gulf in particular, it is unrealistic to expect any sort of peacekeeping forces from the Gulf being there doing good work and working together without U.S. leadership and support. So, we could have another nasty proxy war if we just bring in these guys that will support different groups. That's exactly what happened in Syria in the beginning. The Qataris and the Saudis were supporting different actors. The Turks were supporting different actors, and at the end, it just added to the chaos and instability. So in this case, I don't want to use the word nation building, but without U.S. leadership in the region, without U.S. coordination, then nothing can happen. But I do think that President Trump has a point, and that is that the Arab states and the Gulf Arab states in particular should have equity in this. This is where U.S. Arab future can come together and help stabilize the region. For that reason, right now, the first priority will have to be to settle this dispute in the Gulf so that the resources, the economic resources, the military capabilities that we have developed by training the various armies in the GCC, we can bring them together in Syria and help stabilize the areas. I think that that's also the opportunity in Iraq. I think in the best case scenario of Iraq is that Iraq remains an independent state, not an Iranian client state. And in order for that to happen, we have to encourage and push for further GCC-Iraq relations and strengthen those dynamics and help strengthen the peace and the stability operations. So there's some opportunity there.
Before we move on to Dr. Khattab, either one of you have a thought on the future of Assad?
Well, I think trying to overthrow Iran and trying to overthrow Assad and making that a military goal is a bridge too far. But I think it should be a long-term diplomatic goal, because as long as he's there, Syria is going to be a broken and unstable state that will generate spillover, very toxic spillover effects to its neighbors. So, over time, I think the U.S. should be looking to move him out of there, but I think that's going to be a long-term diplomatic process.
Sarah, do you have any thoughts on Assad?
I think
shrugging shoulders is good. That works a lot with Syria policy.
The wild card is that the Israelis said that unless the Iranians back down in Syria, then Assad will be up for a target. Right. So I think that's a wild card. We don't quite know how that will play out.
Doctor?
Okay, I just want to comment on something Dr. Neubauer said about U.S. leadership, which is very important. The reason why we have the chaos we have in the Arab world, in the post-Arab Spring, is because of U.S. retrenchment during Obama era. Because U.S. was a balancing factor between the different regional powers, between Turkey, Saudi, Israel, Iran. Now when the U.S. retrenched from the region, this allowed for the regional powers, Turkey, Iran, and Saudi, to compete among each other. And this is why we have this proxy war. Each one has his hand in Syria. So the U.S. leadership is very, very important. It will create a balancing factors, and I think U.S. should broker a deal between the different countries to have stability, because each one of them is feeding a proxy, it's feeding a militia on the ground. I'll go back to Madam, your question about civil society, and it ties to Robin. Is when Robin asks, when Daesh withdraws, what do we have? We'll have a void. Who will fill this void? And actually, the best element to fill the void is the civil society. And it's not something coming down from the moon. It existed. What happened, how these local councils, and I didn't speak much about them because we only have 8 minutes. Now it's good I have a chance. Thank you for the questions, because I'm very adamant on local council. Local councils are an indigenous experience. The local council started forming when the government in Syria, as type of punishment, started withdrawing services. Like they don't send teacher, they don't give. So people among themselves started organizing their affairs, started organizing their basic services. Like someone who would be a doctor, who would be now responsible for teaching the kids. Someone else who maybe a merchant was responsible for collecting the trash. And this is how the local council started spontaneously. And they actually now, because the Syrian crisis took so long, they got some expertise, they got some skills, they got more formalized, they have elections, they are the nucleus of any democratic, free Syria and stable Syria we want to see, because they choose their leadership by an election or consensus, but there is election. Last time I read a report about the election of the local councils in Saraki, tears came to my eye, because you see a real democratic experience in front of our eyes in the Arab world with a big, very strong women, contribution, with women participation. So the best alternative is this one, civil alternative. And I hope something in Syria, you don't want the alternative to be, let's say, what after Assad, post-Assad, what do you do? The worst thing would be to bring a solution similar to the one that brought to Lebanon, where the militiamen, the warlords, became the government. And this is why after 20 years you don't have electricity, you don't have trash collection, because militiamen cannot become statesmen. They have predatory attitude, they have the rent-seeking behavior. So the key is to marginalize, and to marginalize them, you have to start with their bosses, which are the regional powers, and to pave the way for the civil society to take a greater role. And the governments should start bottom up. And this is how you fill the void. This is the local councils would be the nucleus for the governance, for the government, and it should be a decentralization. And I think for Syria, the best formula is administrative decentralization, because administrative decentralization is the only viable alternative to political decentralization, which will basically break up the country into 3-4 states that will keep on fighting among each other. And what we can do, and I think, Steve, you asked what can we do. First, we have to do capacity building for these local councils, because a lot of the UN agencies, European Union agency worked with them, but they work with them more on a relief basis, like to provide relief and assistance, but no one has really worked with them on capacity building. There should be more engagement with them, capacity building, and to look at them in the long run as the basis for the state, as the basis for the government. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank all our panelists for a great discussion. So I use the word center of gravity with some intentionality. So the way Clausewitz, who said you do a lot of things in wars. You bomb, you go left, you go right, you go center. But at the end of the day, there's something that is animating your opponent, right, which enables them to be strong and resilient. And you want to get to that. And I think this has been helpful in the discussion as we think about transnational terrorism as a phenomenon. We could talk about all kinds of things, radicalization online and social networking and this and that and everything else. But you kind of made an argument here today that the center of gravity, the root of this problem is in the Middle East. And it is rooted in the conditions and policies of a cluster of states, and unless those conditions are ameliorated, that there's always the smolder, right, that the forest fire can rage back again. I think that's interesting and provocative analysis. It's very helpful and lays out a very dramatic series of challenges for this administration in exercising leadership in the region. So please join me in thanking our panelists, and thank you so much for coming.